Again, I'm Kristen Lillvis. I'm an associate professor at Marshall University, and I direct our Digital Humanities program. And until this year, I also directed our grad program. So I'd be happy to talk just with you also about strategies for job market and things like that, because I have worked with every single student we had. And now I continue. I also am a faculty in residence, so I live in a residence hall on campus. And so every student in like a 6-dorm radius comes to me with a CV and resume. So that is my unpaid side gig. It is surprisingly kind of fun. So this session is about innovating in the humanities, and I'll run through some of what I have planned. The people who are here, I think you fit really well with what I'm talking about, but please feel free, like if you want to stop me and ask a question, and I'm going to leave plenty of time anyway so that we can kind of just chat, but this doesn't have to go in some strict form. So, oops.
Substance take precedence over structure.
Yes. So when I'm saying why innovate, I'm always kind of starting with the digital humanities because that's my particular thing. And it doesn't have to just be digital humanities, but for me, innovating in the humanities started there, in that the digital humanities, which I define very broadly as anything that brings technology and the arts and the humanities together. So looking at how technology can help us answer questions about what it means to be human. It has been really useful for helping me innovate because it has put me into contact with people in other departments and colleges and also universities. So I've done several things with Ohio University because of digital humanities. And that has brought me to some things that have been really influential to my scholarship. So one, it's helped me identify new scholarly interests. So because of my work in the digital humanities, I started out in contemporary literature, and particularly contemporary African American literature. I'm now working on a major grant project that relates to recovery from substance use disorders in Appalachia. And there are ways that that's really connected to some of the contemporary literature work that I've been doing, but mostly it has come out of collaborating with people in other departments who wanted to talk to me about DH tools and techniques and who I could learn from about those things. The other thing, and I'd be happy to talk, I have a case study at the bottom, but we can talk more about that too. The other thing that I think innovating in the humanities does, and particularly if you can get that term digital humanities in there, is that it does appeal to hiring and admission committees. So this article on the left is from the Chronicle in 2017. And it's talking about the DH boom in the academic job market. And if you've been looking at the job lists, have you started looking yet, Sean? Okay, yeah. And you're still a little early for looking. I would not look until you have to. Don't start yet. Yeah, it's not fun. But I think one thing that innovating does, allows you ways to think about different types of jobs you can apply for that still are actually jobs suited to you. So I know when I was coming out of grad school, I could apply for American Lit and African American Lit jobs, and I could maybe apply for a women's studies job because I do mostly women's literature. But that was still, those are kind of closely related, right? The best job I was going to get was going to be a job that wanted somebody who did African American women's literature, which is there, right? That job exists. Now, because I've been doing stuff with digital humanities, one, I can apply to jobs that are just asking for DH, and surprisingly, you don't need to have all that much DH experience to be relevant for those jobs. So thinking about doing work with video games, you already can apply for a lot of those jobs. With some of your work with Emily Dickinson, I can think of lots of ways that you could do digital text analysis, like natural language processing stuff that we could talk about, that if you did one project with that, you would be qualified to apply for a digital humanities job. And I like that because this, as this Chronicle article is saying, it is one of the places in the academic job market that has seen a little bit of growth. And I know for a while, when you looked, it was pretty grim. I'm not saying this year is still necessarily a great year. And DH, there's also 1,000 articles you'll find where people are like, it's a fad. yeah, it's a fad, maybe, but people are still hiring in it. And if we think about where the world is going and where the academic job market is going, it's going to continue. The one on the right is an article from actually the Harvard Business Review, and it's talking about Silicon Valley and the Pentagon and how they're looking for critical thinkers. And not that I think everybody in the humanities needs to necessarily leave and go into the business world, but it is shocking what opens up if you do some of this innovation and collaboration. So for example, I was on a team that had a challenge from Intuit, if you've heard of the TurboTax company. So they did a challenge at Marshall University for us to come up with creative solutions to big problems. And our team came up with a virtual reality product to help deal with substance use disorders. And I was working with students and faculty in business, in engineering, communication studies. And we won this challenge, and we were flown out to California, and we went to Google, and we went to Facebook, and we had meetings with the top people at Intuit. And if you had ever told me that I was gonna go have a face-to-face meeting with the guy who runs Intuit, I would have said that's not going to happen, right? But because somebody's like, hey, you'd be a good fit in helping the people on this team think about research questions, I got to learn from all of them and get some of these contacts that I otherwise wouldn't have had. And I will say, when I went, as this article is talking about, one of the things they kept saying again and again is, we want people who can think critically and who can write. So if you have those skills because you're in the humanities, that really does transfer. But making connections with people in other disciplines while you're a grad student is useful, because then you have people in other disciplines to vouch for you. Because if I just say to somebody in business, I promise I can write and think critically, but if I don't know what your world is like, you're not going to hire me. But like if Brad Smith would be like, hey, I've met her on multiple occasions, right, that's going to go a long way. The other thing that I think Innovating really does is it allows you to practice new strategies for developing, presenting, and publishing your research. Now when I do a presentation, I build a website every time. It's an Adobe Spark website. It takes no longer than to do a PowerPoint, but I have these saved. I can link them on my professional website. I can link them on my Digital Humanities site that I run for Marshall, and automatically everything I do looks that much more professional. And really this takes me 15 minutes to do. And so I think that's something that's a plus. It also lets me break out of traditional ways of presenting, that if you've been especially to an academic conference in English, we are the worst people in the world at that. All we do is stand up there and read a paper. It is so boring. But even if I'm just gonna stand up there and read the paper, if I could direct my audience to, here's a website you could scroll through while I'm reading, right? Or here's a persistent link other than a Google Doc where you can find this information beyond, I think that can be kind of useful. Also, from my digital humanities work, I have done a major research project on pinball machines, which I just mentioned because it's cool. But I got to go to Rutgers University and present on that in a really non-traditional sort of academic thing. Yeah, there have been a lot of opportunities to get outside of a traditional going to MLA or going to one of the big conferences and going to these other places. I've also done some publishing on writing and teaching students in STEM courses how to write. And if you look at journals that are focused on teaching, they're very exciting if you're excited about collaborations across discipline lines. And so that's something I've been able to do. And then, like I said, finding potential collaborators and colleagues, and this really can easily start in grad school. You have to be careful that you're not putting yourself so out there that you're getting burdened with doing a million things. But I do think there are ways you can do various things. And I'll give you this link later, but it talks a little bit about the game studies presentation that I did, like I said, on pinball machines. I've been working with somebody who's doing work on sermon studies and stylometry, and this in some ways could be interesting related to Emily Dickinson. Have you done anything with stylometry before? It's basically you can attribute an author to text that you don't know if the author wrote or not, or you can find out specific things about an author's style through these different programs, and it's kind of cool. So for example, I have a colleague who works in Whitman studies, and there are some unsigned documents that people have thought were written by Walt Whitman, and they can, by running them through this program, go, yeah, they actually very likely were, like 99% likelihood Walt Whitman actually wrote this, even if we didn't know. It's also really cool if a text is collaboratively written, you can actually see which parts were by one author and which were by another, and that's kind of a fun thing.
They use that on Shakespeare?
Yes, yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. Yeah, so that's, I think, really fun, and these are things that can be kind of complicated, but also they aren't terribly. And this is an easy way to collaborate. As soon as you're interested in something like that, you can talk to people in other departments and colleges and say, so I have this research idea I'd like to do. You have the technical abilities. Let's work together on that. We could jointly do a presentation or jointly do a publication, and that's going to be something that's a lot of interest to an audience, but also useful for you and to that other person. I'm team teaching a class right now on coding in the digital humanities. Do you know how much code I know? Essentially zero. So for that portion of the class, I sit and I'm learning Python with my students, but I'm helping them develop research questions that we can use Python to answer. And so it's been really great for me and my collaborating teacher who's in computer science, but it's also giving me new ideas for my research. There's a couple other things on there. The gadgetry, this second to last button, this comes from a conference that I went to, and Grant Windhoff, who's a scholar, he's working on a book for a general audience about the history of gadgets and really like looking at when that word gadget came into use and how it's changed over time. And he's doing it and through a digital publishing platform, which is a new thing that's out there that is growing and that I think is something that if I were a grad student I would try to take advantage of, because I know as a faculty member I am now, especially if you're doing something with game studies, and to think about that being published in a flat like journal that isn't interactive, right, or a book that isn't interactive is a loss to what you're talking about. So if you can do some of these online publishing platforms that are affiliated with the university, it is a major publication, but it allows you to have a little bit more interactivity there. And another example of that is Torn Apart / Separados. And so this author, one of the authors of this project was just here at Ohio University for that camp, which is a Digital Humanities Unconference, and she talked about this mapping project and all of the different people who came together to work on this, and again, collaborating across discipline lines. And so just one of my kind of final notes is you want to be flexible and multifaceted, but not fickle. So when I'm looking at my CV, I see that I've moved from a print publication on African American women's mostly print literature to now I'm doing this digital humanities project. I need to make sure that I can clearly communicate how those things are linked and how I got from one to the other, because I don't want my whole first half of my career to be something that I'm like, oh, that's what I used to do, but now I'm doing this. I need to talk about how those things are united. So even when we were just chatting before this, I said, oh yeah, it was mostly African American women's print literature, but I also looked at film and music videos and art, right? So I'm setting myself up as always looking at multimedia, and now I'm just doing that in a new way, so I can create that thread. And that's something that I would recommend as you're going on the job market in the humanities, thinking about that thread that you can connect. And the last thing on there is just talking about my particular project I'm working on right now, the collaborative project about narratives of recovery. And it's a mapping project, and so we have faculty and staff at Marshall in English, Geography, Digital Humanities, Addiction Studies, and our wellness program. I've also talked about collaborating with people at other universities, and we have funding sources that range from state humanities councils to government innovation grants to potentially NEH and NSF grants. And so that idea of innovating has opened me up really to a lot of different funding opportunities, which is a major bonus too. So what questions can I answer for you, or anything you can tell me about what you're doing in particular that maybe I could provide a perspective on? Sean, because you're farther along, I can pick on you for a second. How are you marketing yourself right now on the job market?
Well, I mean, I'm mostly looking to go to a teaching-focused university as opposed to, say, a research-based university.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the main things I'm doing is actually milking my contacts. I have developed close relationships with department heads and my advisors over the course of my 3-step undergrad, master's, and PhD, and I'm kind of making sure that I'm keeping up with them, telling them what I'm doing, asking them if they know anyone, and I'm kind of doing a lot of schmoozing.
That's good. When you think about like your cover letter, are you selling yourself as like rec comp primarily?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yes. Rec comp positions, they're both more marketable and also in higher demand.
Sure.
So.
What are your secondary areas if you have those?
Rhetoric composition and digital humanities, multimodality.
Okay.
That sort of thing. I mean, I can teach. I have a master's in English Lit, and my focus was rec comp and classical rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
So I can teach. I could teach Shakespeare. I've done papers on Shakespeare before. I could teach Elizabethan plays. I could also teach. I'm having a brain fart. Classics.
Yeah.
Talking about like ancient Greek writing, and I'm intimately familiar with rhetoric by Aristotle,
Sure.
and with Plato's stuff, and all of the dialogues and all that.
I think that's all important stuff to think about when you are going on that market, because I've chaired or been on probably at least half a dozen search committees since I've been at Marshall. So I have obviously been on the job market, and now I'm on the other side of it. And I know that really now, if you're looking at the ads, they are going to ask you to do one thing, and especially at a teaching school, they're going to say, and we also want you to do 5 of these 15 other things, because departments are getting funding cut off, and so I might only get one hired to replace, say, three people.
They want to know how many holes you can plug.
Yes, and so that's the thing I think about being multifaceted but not fickle is really key. So I have to make a case that I can teach these multiple other things, but I have to make sure that they understand that I'm not just reading their ad and saying every single word that they have asked me to fill in. But I have to really make a case that I could do it. And so when you said you've written a paper on Shakespeare, have you published it or presented on it?
I presented on it, but it was just a little side project.
That's good though, right? Because so I know when I'm on these committees, if I'm reading this and one of the side areas said Shakespeare, and you said you could do it, I'm going to read your letter, and it's going to be basically alongside your CV, and I'm going to go, can he really do it? Yep, there it is.
Yeah.
Right there, he did a presentation, and so that's going to make a big deal that there is evidence on that CV. And I think milking your contacts is good, but if that person you're in contact with isn't on that search committee, it only goes so far, because if I'm looking at 100 or 200 applications, unfortunately the first thing I'm doing is to look who I can cut out, because that makes my job easier. So who can fill a few holes, but more than you can fill every hole, who can fill a few of them really well?
It's less that I'm seeing if they're on the committee and more asking them who they know and who they can introduce me to, and then befriending them and asking them who they know and
Yeah.
who they feel comfortable introducing me to, and it's kind of like building that sort of network.
Yeah, I think that helps a lot. I think definitely as you're going along, work with your graduate college and work with your department on the job letter, because the number one thing that when we're making hiring decisions that I look at is the job letter and your CV, and I look at your recommendations if I've already decided you're not automatically excluded from those 2 things, right? If I look at those 2 things and I'm like, I don't know, I don't think so, I'm not even going to read your recs. And I'm not going to look at your writing sample, because those things take me a lot of time. But to just look at that letter is pretty quick. And so I think looking at how you can in that letter and how you can in your CV show that you fill those multiple areas, that you can innovate, right, that you can make connections is really key. I love the 3-minute thesis competition, because I think not only is it the elevator pitch when you're at the job market, but also that's practice for how you can write in 4 sentences what you've spent 7 years doing, you know? Yeah. Yeah. So there's a couple really easy ways you can do text analysis with digital tools. So one with the natural language processing, some of that's a little bit more sophisticated, but a really easy tool you can go to is Voyant-tools or -tools.org. And with this tool, you can paste in a text or a book, or in fact, multiple books. So I do this with my students with every Harry Potter book. And we paste we upload all 7 books full text. And when I hit reveal, what it will do is it's going to show patterns in language. It's going to show most common words. It's going to do just some really cool, sort of basic, but also really sophisticated analysis. And an example I often show a friend I went to grad school with, he uses Voyant tools, and he published a book called the Jay-Z Mixtape. This is an online publication, but an online academic publication, so it is associated with an academic press. This is in Scalar, I think, which is a really a common online medium right now. The other big one is called Mallet that people seem to use, or it's not Mallet, sorry, I'll think of it in a second. But what he has in this book is you can see visualizations where he's analyzing word usage, for example. And so he's looking at personal pronouns, so how often Jay-Z, says I, for example. And we get this interesting graphic, and he's using another software program to get his graphics, but he's doing all of his analysis through Voyant, which is this free online program that you can do. And it's providing something that he's able to publish in a way that is much more interesting. He's received major grants for this work that he's doing because he's in this innovative field. We can see it's still, the type of academic analysis that we're familiar with, but using these programs, he's able to get at him through this information data way. Yeah, and sorry, bad language, but but yeah, we can see some of these patterns that are possible there. And this is just one example. The natural language processing and the stylometry, there's a couple ways you can do that. Natural language processing, Stanford has a toolkit that you can work with, which does require knowing a little bit of code. And the stylometry, that part I don't know quite as much about. But there are ways you don't have to have a lot of technical abilities and you can get into it. Yeah. And I think we only have about a minute because I have the instructions to hard stop at 1:25. Well, thank you for being here. And I'll give you a card in case you have questions. And specifically, if you do have additional questions about the DH stuff, send me an email because I can look it up and get back to you more quickly than I can recall it all. Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you. So I'm excited that everybody's in such different fields, and so I have a few things I'm going to run through, but if you would like at any point to stop me and ask me to pause and say, how does this apply to me, or can you tie this to econ or math or chemistry or whatever, I'd be happy to give it a go. I will say I've done some work. One of my favorite people in the world is a math professor that I work with regularly. So I do a lot of work, surprisingly, with math. I also have done some work with people in business and economics on some projects. And then my new project has to do a little bit with neurobiology, but I'm really bastardizing it and applying it to literature, so I have to be honest about that. So I just want to talk about why you might collaborate together, right? How the people in this room, how you all might be able to help each other. And one way you can do that is through this field called Digital Humanities. Have people heard about DH before? Some yes, some no. It's a buzzword, at least on the arts and humanities side of things. I don't know if the STEM people care about it all quite so much, but the reason I like it is because I think the name, one, it's kind of not useful because what does it mean? But it is also useful because those two words independently are clear. So for me, digital humanities as a humanities person is useful because that word digital suggests that I have some technology and even then getting beyond technology to thinking about computer science and beyond the humanities abilities that make me appeal to people who maybe aren't focused on the arts and the humanities. What digital humanities is very broadly is bringing together anything that looks at technology and the arts and humanities. So thinking about how technology can help us answer questions about the world. And that's really this broad way that I define it. I find it useful, again, for arts and humanities grad students. This is an article from the Chronicle from 2017, and it's talking about people on this arts and humanities side. It's one of the few fields that has had some protection on the academic job market, that is in fact is shown some growth. And so if you're on that side, it's useful to you. If you're not though, if you're on the STEM side, why might you care about digital humanities? This is an article from the Washington Post, and it's talking about Google employees' top qualities. So there have been some studies done on this, and the top skill that Google employees were looking for, and I'll read them to you. It was that their employees were a good coach, they were good at communicating and listening, they possessed insights into others, including empathy, they were good critical thinkers and problem solvers, and they make connections across complex disciplines. After all of that was they have a technical skill. And so the other reason I like digital humanities, because if you are somebody in one of those fields, you now have the word humanities lumped on to whatever you're doing, and that suggests critical thinking and problem solving that might be useful in your field. Because even if you aren't in a field that's going to require you to write very often, you still have to write to get that job, and you have to do presentations usually or communicate with others. And so if you can show that you have some skills in that, possibly through DH, that's one way to make some advancements. So what does it look like? For me, I see interdisciplinary collaboration in every facet of what I do. So this is just a flyer from a course that I'm team teaching now that's called Coding for the Digital Humanities. And it's me, a faculty from computer science, and a faculty member from math, actually. And we are teaching students Python, and we are teaching them how to analyze texts using Python. So for the portion of the class where students are using Python, I sit with them and I learn Python too. But then I stand up and say, okay, now that we've gotten this skill and we can do this text analysis, why? And so I talk about research questions that they might want to investigate, and I talk about ways to move forward with, if you have all of this textual data, what are you going to do with it? Why? Why is it there? Why are you analyzing it? This has been fantastic. One, I'm learning new ways to teach because I'm working with people in computer science and math, and they have communicated as well that they're learning new ways to teach. We're talking about projects we can work on together going forward, which is useful for me because it opens me to new sources of funding, and it opens them to new sources of funding. So if we think about grant funding, which as you go forward might be a major way that you either get a job or maintain a job, I in the humanities am not going to get as much grant funding as somebody in the sciences probably. However, I might have some sources of funding that are easier to get, even if they're smaller. So state humanities councils, for example, are often a good way to get funding. You can't maybe get that on a straight economics or math or science project, but if you tie to somebody in the humanities, you can get that. And so that's a way to move forward. Think about how this collaboration is going to be useful. For research, I'm working on a research project that is involving mapping narratives of recovery from substance use disorders. And I have team members in English, geography, digital humanities, addiction studies, and the wellness program. And again, we're open to funding opportunities that none of us would ever have if we were just working alone. So by collaborating, we're able to get these external sources of funding. And this might be of some interest to the people who are in economics, for example. I was part of a team that Intuit sponsored a Design for Delight competition at my university. So Intuit's the TurboTax company. And my team won. And I worked with students and faculty in business, communication studies, computer science, and English. And so we got to go, they flew us out to Silicon Valley. We met with people at Google and Facebook, and the top people at Intuit had one-on-one conversations with us about this project that we came up with over the course of like 2 months. So if you had ever told me that I'd be talking, one-on-one with people at Intuit in California, and I'm an English professor, I would say I don't think that's true, but it did really happen. And so those are links also that are useful, because that experience, the design of this competition was for people to collaborate, and by agreeing to participate in that, I got to make some connections that otherwise I wouldn't have been able to make. So this is just my pitch for why working with people who might seem outside of your field can be really useful. And I have ideas for how, I haven't talked as much about like people in chemistry and things like that and biological sciences, how you could be involved as well. But there are actually, I think, really cool projects that we could see, cross collaboration on. So what questions do you have, or what might I be able to help with?
Just kind of what that project looked like, and some of the details of that kind of collaboration.
Yeah, so
Who brings what to the table?
Yeah, so Intuit came in and taught us this process called Designing for Delight, and it has to do with rapid prototyping. And they asked people at Marshall, who were formed into teams by a variety of disciplines, to solve some of the biggest problems. And they really did they were like, solve the problem of students not learning enough in elementary school. My team was tasked with solving the problem of substance use disorders. And we were going to do that in 2 months, right? Well, that's sort of impossible. But they know it's impossible. But by giving us such a huge task and saying, go, there's no limit on what your solution could be, we actually came up with some cool things. So my team came up with a virtual reality education solution. We didn't make it, right? It was about making the idea and doing a sort of a rapid prototype that could just be we made fake sunglasses, right? And we said, pretend these are virtual reality goggles. Let me describe to you a scenario. Let me help you and walk you through this experience. And so that was something that was really interesting, working with the people in business and having them talk about what was actually possible, right? What was feasible. The students in communication studies and computer science brought a different perspective. I came from this English side, talking about what we might call it, how we might market in terms of the language of it. And so it was really interesting to see these collaborations I never would have imagined. And out of that now, I can see future collaborations. So there are people now I work with in business, the College of Business, that I never would have met before this project. And so we're doing a lot of the same things in terms of forming centers for innovation where students can go and work with tools. That's the same thing I'm doing that they're doing. And so what are ways that we can work together on that instead of just reproducing the same thing? Other questions? Yeah?
How do you even begin to search out who to collaborate with?
Great question. One way you can do it is through things like this. So going to a place where you're in a room with lots of different people and saying, so here's the thing I work on, and really being open to other people going, oh, I do something that seems just a tiny bit related, and then making that link. So for example, I've done a project on teaching writing in STEM classes and ways to help students learn how to convey their ideas in writing, even if it's not an essay, if it's literally an answer to a test question, and how you can write better test questions to help students do better in their answers. And that came from, I had a friend in geography, and he was like, or geology rather, and he's like, my students aren't doing well on their tests. And I said, oh man, like why? And he's like, I don't know, they keep giving me bad answers. And so then we just started having a conversation, and then we were like, oh, I bet we could study that together. And then we got grant funding to study that. And so really, I think just making sure you're trying to interact with people who aren't just in your program and in your department is really helpful. The other thing I was recommending to some people at my table is if you have an interest and you would like to do something, and a way you can find something to do is to think about something that's topical right now. If you went to like the graduate college and said, there are a couple of us in different fields who want to talk about this issue, is there anything we could do? They would be like, yeah, sure, I'm sure we can set up some event or something where you could just talk with people, right? So we had somebody come in recently who wrote the book, I can't remember the title of it, something about parasites. It was a pretty popular book, and like the parasites all around us and how they're affecting us and things like that. Like, if you were like, I want to talk about this, but I also want somebody in another department and somebody else in this other department, like if you have an idea you'd like to work on, people will help you find the opportunity to do it. Yeah. Does that help? I do think that advice that the grad director or grad chair was talking about, like looking at events that are for graduate students, will help you do that, because then you're forced to interact with lots of other people. Kristen?
That's kind of my question. How do you, like, is there a particular platform or website or social media group or something where you find out about these types of opportunities? Like, I don't know, where you learn about meetings where it's not just your department, right?
Yeah.
It's college-wide, or it's bringing people even better outside of the college.
Yeah.
Right?
I think part of it is you're going to have to ask people who are involved in in that area so they can help you identify what they are. Mm-hmm. So for me, if you're interested in digital humanities, there are a couple of major workshops that happen every year. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest ones that I've went to twice is DHSI, Digital Humanities Summer Institute. It is in Victoria, British Columbia, which is a little far away, right? And it's not free. But there are scholarships for students, and especially if you're going for your first time. And I have gone to that twice, and this last time I was in a group with librarians, people in computer science, people in anthropology, a couple people in English, and it was mostly grad students. And out of that, I now have somebody in there, he runs a podcast and an online journal that I'm working with a group that we're going to submit to. There's other people out of that experience. Somebody said, oh, at my school there's an online journal, but the editors can't do it anymore. And somebody at the conference said, oh, I'd like to do that. That person is now editing this journal, right, that they just met somebody at this conference about. So those types of bigger national or international things, if you can go and look for funding, right, like don't pay to go, try to get the funding to go, can be huge. But finding that is talking to people who are in that field who can tell you what those things are. Other questions?
I know you define the digital humanities, but intuitively, simply what is meant by digital humanities?
What is made or what is meant?
What's meant?
Yeah, so like the definition really I do think is very broadly using technology to answer questions about humanity. So for me, because I am in English and I study texts, a lot of times it's using digital tools to analyze written texts, to analyze language. So there's a bunch of online tools that are free that people can use. I was showing the last group, there's one called Voyant Tools, where you can upload a corpus, so one text or multiple texts, to this site, and it will tell you most used words, frequency, relationships. It'll tell you all these things about one text or 50 texts, right, or more, right? And so that's something, I could do that by reading a book, but I couldn't do that for reading 500 books, right, in any sort of reasonable amount of time, but I can use technology to help me. But it doesn't just have to be that. So for example, I'm working on a project now where we're mapping, so we're taking coordinates that talk about where people felt was significant in terms of a moment for recovery, and those are going to be organized on a map so that you can really track patterns in how the recovery movement is happening in West Virginia and Appalachia and the nation. And so using that digital tool of a map to give us a better sense of how movement is occurring in terms of recovery. So just bringing together some of those different worlds. Yes?
In terms of different projects that you're working on, or more broadly, I guess, in digital humanities, is it typical for one person to sort of take the lead, or is it completely collaborative in terms of, like, I'm thinking about grant funding, for example. How does that work? Is everyone sort of equally involved?
It can depend. So usually digital humanities projects tend to be very collaborative. And so the project I'm working on now, there are 4 of us, I think, or maybe 5 of us, and we see ourselves as equal partners. However, we're going to end up being able to hire on other people to work on the grant who will also be funded, but probably won't be the primary investigators, right? So you will have to pick somebody who's, you know, one or a few people who are the PIs for your project, the primary investigators who are responsible for the grant paperwork. And that tends to be, I think, in an ideal digital humanities world, it's pretty open and equal, though of course it depends on the people in the project. Yeah. Other questions?
I just have one more.
Yeah.
It's still kind of related to my first
No, that's good.
So, like, if you are a professor and you know you want to collaborate with someone to do the specific skill that you might not have, like digitally.
Yeah.
So is there a person at your university that helps connect other people that are looking for collaborations?
Yes.
Or is it just on you to happenstance find someone that could help you with this?
That's an awesome question. So at my university, it's me because I direct the Digital Humanities program, but we also have a librarian who helps too. So if you're here and you're interested in digital humanities, one of the things they're working on is figuring out who a central person is that you might talk to. And there are a couple people who are talking about who that might be, but one person who is really involved is Janet Carlton in the libraries, and she is a digital humanities or digital reference librarian, and so she would be a person who might not say, here's the answer to what you're looking for, but she can say, here are 3 people you should talk to. So I would really recommend reaching out to her. I think if you're stuck on who to ask about anything, I always say turn to the libraries because they have to deal with everybody. So they don't just talk to one department or one faculty member, they really talk to everyone.
And at OU, there are subject librarians,
Yes.
right? Who, like Lorraine Walkner, for example, is the English department librarian,
Yes.
but she also does film studies, and I think African American studies and dance. So you're absolutely right. That's a great suggestion, that plugging into the library is plugging into everyone.
Yes, and you're librarians, so I ran a digital humanities unconference here 2 weeks ago, and one of the biggest groups that attended from Ohio were your librarians. So there's a good chance that if you reach out to somebody who's like your disciplines librarian, that person may have been there. If not, they know one of the 10 other librarians who was. Yeah. Well, I think we're supposed to stop. But thank you all for being here. I have my card if there's any additional questions you might have or anything I can help you with. I think I maybe mentioned I was the grad director at Marshall for like 5 years until this year it stopped. So if you also just have questions about grad school and how to make sure you're an attractive applicant, if you're applying, well, are you all PhD students? Okay, yeah, not all. So if you're not a PhD student, about applying to PhDs, but if you're a PhD student, also about going on the job market after, I'd be happy to talk about that too.
I have a question about that. So,
Yes.
If you are planning to go to a PhD, usually what you do is that on the internet, every university has their application page, where normally you pay a fee, like maybe $25
Yes.
or $50. But then the whole application is they have customized it for their own university, and it takes a lot of time.
Yes.
So what my friend suggested, one of my friends is already a PhD, and he told me that you can actually go into the university department page and talk to one of the faculty that you are interested to be working with. So you can directly email them that you are interested in their program and that you want to apply, and then you can just send your application through an email, not the university page. You would save a lot of time and you would save some money. How true is that?
So usually you do have to ultimately apply through the university page because they will always want your money. There are different fields though where you might have to work with a particular faculty member and be sort of chosen by that faculty member. So there are some cases where you do have to reach out and email that person. And so I would say talk to people who you're working with now in your department because they'll know the most about that. Your department might have a graduate director. If not, I would think about if there anybody in your department who is a newer hire. So that is another thing too, is sometimes the graduate director isn't somebody who's necessarily been a graduate student recently, and this is same for job market stuff. If you have a job placement person in your department, that isn't necessarily somebody who's been on the job market recently. So also reach out to somebody who is newer because that person can give you really contemporary advice. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you all.